Okay, continuing. So none of the gospel writers or any of the New Testament writers used Psalm 22:16, a passage that, if pierced, actually appeared in it, would certainly seem to carry a powerful prophetic punch. They did use other portions of Psalm 22. For example, Mark and Matthew have Jesus shouting out the first verse of the psalm just before he died. All four Gospels use Psalm 22:18. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. But never Psalm 22:16. Even some Christian apologists concede, quote, that silence carries some weight. Christian apologists have been buoyed by a discovery among the Dead Sea Scrolls that was published back in 1997, namely a fragment that contains Psalm 22:16, which would be the oldest existing textual witness dating back to about the middle of the 1st century CE. The fragment appears to use the Hebrew equivalent of the word used in the Septuagint's translation of the passage, which refers to digging or gouging, and is often rendered by translators as pierced. Despite this find, perhaps even because of it, the controversy continues, with some scholars arguing that it's problematic to have a verb that refers to the digging of ditches and wells used as a reference to piercing hands and feet with nails in crucifixion. Ultimately, it seems to me the most one can say for certain is that Psalm 22:16 is an extremely controversial and uncertain passage that the New Testament writers passed over, and that even in the textual witnesses touted by Christians does not clearly refer to the piercing of hands and feet that would occur in a crucifixion. Hardly the stuff of a compelling prophetic portrait. Third, Psalm 38:11, which says, quote, my loved ones and my friends stand aloof from my plague, and my relatives stand afar off. This passage, again, very popular among Christian apologists, including, without limitation, Josh McDowell, in his The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, in which he lists Psalm 38:11 among fulfilled messianic prophecies. The purported fulfillment is found in Mark 15:40, Matthew 27:55, and Luke 23:49, which have Mary Magdalene, other women who followed Jesus, and other friends or acquaintances standing at a considerable distance from the cross as Jesus is dying on it. Mary Magdalene and the others were, Josh McDowell has in his entry on this, quote, afraid of the danger that they would incur by seeming to take part with Jesus. Now, this seems impressive until one digs a bit more deeply. First, the aforementioned passages from Mark, Matthew, and Luke, touted by McDowell and other apologists as the fulfillment of Psalm 38:11, are contradicted by John's crucifixion narrative, which has Mary Magdalene, Jesus' mother Mary, other women, including Jesus' aunt, and the Apostle John, quote, beside the cross. They're so close that the dying Jesus is able to have a conversation with them, in which he commits his mother to the Apostle John's care. The New Testament claims that Jesus' mother had at least 6 other children, but Jesus never seemed to be all that big on the family thing. In any case, here they are, Jesus' relatives and friends, standing at the foot of his cross, speaking with him. Aloof? Far off? Not according to the author of John's Gospel. Second, if one looks at the full text of Psalm 38, one sees that the person, more correctly penitent, portrayed in the psalm presents a number of problems for traditional Christology. The penitent of Psalm 38 is an anxious and foolish sinner with burning loins. Let's listen to a bit of what he has to say. Verses 3 and 4. There is no health in my bones because of my sin, for my iniquities have gone over my head. As a heavy burden, they weigh too much for me. Verse 18. I confess my iniquity. I'm full of anxiety because of my sin. In verse 5, he talks about his folly. Is this a description of Jesus that Christians are willing to embrace? That seems highly unlikely. Therefore, one must wonder why verse 11 would be plucked out of the monologue by this anxious, burdened, and foolish sinner and presented as if it were a messianic prophecy about Jesus' crucifixion. Farrell Till, a former pastor, hits the nail on the head in his 1996 Skeptical Review essay entitled Prophecy Fulfillment, an Unprovable Claim. Till writes in reference to gospel writers, but it applies also to Christian apologists, quote, "The gospel writers were desperate to prove that their man Jesus was the Messiah who had been promised in the Old Testament. Since there really were no prophecies of a virgin-born, crucified, resurrected Messiah in the Old Testament, they had to twist and distort to give the appearance that Jesus was the long-awaited one." Now, we've seen this twisting and distorting repeatedly in this series, and here we see it again as regards Christian apologists' abuse of Psalm 38, a psalm about an anxious, burdened, and foolish sinner. Fourth and finally, Psalm 34:20, which says, "He," that is God, "guards all of his bones. Not one of them is broken." This one has been popular with Christian apologists going back to the earliest days of Christianity. One of the New Testament writers, namely the author of John, claimed this as a prophecy fulfilled at Jesus' crucifixion. John 19:31-36 says, "The Jews," it's always the Jews in John, "wanted the bodies off the crosses before the Sabbath began. So they asked Pilate to have the crucified men's legs broken, including Jesus' legs. When the soldiers got to Jesus, he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs." The author of John claims, quote, "This came to pass that the scripture might be fulfilled, not a bone of his shall be broken." Contemporary Christian apologists are quite fond of Psalm 34:20, consistently presenting it as a fulfilled messianic prophecy about Jesus' crucifixion. This includes Josh McDowell in his The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Some skeptics claim that the author of John didn't accurately quote Psalm 34:20, and therefore the best that can be said is that it's a paraphrase, the worst that it's a fabrication. While the author of John's Gospel is not above attributing statements to the Hebrew Scriptures that don't actually appear in them, see, for example, John 7:38, which has Jesus speaking, quote, "He who believes in me, as the Scripture said, from his innermost being shall flow rivers of living water." There is no such passage in the Hebrew Scriptures. However, with respect to Psalm 34:20, the author of John basically gets it right. The text is there, at least. The real problem is that Psalm 34 says nothing about the Messiah. It's a song of praise to Yahweh for protecting the righteous and hearing the cries of the poor. Once again, we see a New Testament writer and Christian apologist shoehorning Jesus into a passage that is not messianic. The truth of what Farrell Till wrote back in 1996 is demonstrated again. Since there were really no prophecies of a virgin-born, crucified, resurrected Messiah in the Old Testament, they had to twist and distort to give the appearance that Jesus was the long-awaited one. In other words, the Jesus story just didn't fit the actual messianic prophetic portrait, so Christians made up their own prophetic portrait based on misquotations, mistranslations, and misapplications of passages in the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus is not the Messiah. Thanks.